That makes sense. So this framework of expectations of actions of others, right? So it lets us kind of decomplexify the world, right? If we can trust that someone's going to behave along a certain gradient, that helps us focus on other things versus worrying about if they're going to stab you in the back or something like that. Um, and so then to your point, the morality is emerging from our sociality, I guess. And then the more complex those social interactions become, the more complex morality becomes. So what I wanted to get to, and I mentioned this to you offline, that I have this kind of hypothesis that there's a relationship between the free market and the emergence of virtue, that the more sophisticated our market relations become, uh, it actually calls out the need for higher virtue in a way. So, for instance, honesty. I guess if you had very limited interactions with others and you're just a caveman trying to eat your meal, honesty may not be a strong suit for you. It's just kind of like take whatever action is necessary to eat or reproduce today. Whereas if you're a capitalist in the 21st century and you've got long production processes and you've got to deal with people over long time horizons, honesty is very clearly a dominant strategy, because if you're dishonest, you'd betray your reputation. It would have all these second order, third order consequences. So how do you think about the relationship between markets and, I guess, the sophistication of markets, or we could say maybe even the wealth they're generating? Because another way I think about this, and please tell me wherever I'm wrong, is that morality is in some ways luxuriant. Like, again, the caveman doesn't really have time to worry about morality or sit around and read Plato. He's just trying to, get it done for the day. Whereas we in modernity, thanks to the market, we have all this free time, all this wealth to sit back and reflect on moral virtues and behaviors. How are these two things related? The development of the free market and virtue and or morality?
I think this is a big underappreciated aspect of the development of market economies, is the kind of moral impact that they have, particularly on how we treat strangers and also how we think of ourselves in terms of our kind of professional role, our public facing role that's kind of separate from our private family role.
Mm.
I think there is a bit of a stereotype that morality is not relevant to kind of hunter-gatherer tribal people. Actually, they do a lot of moral judgment all the time, right?
Mm.
It's very physically grounded. It's like a good hunter is a good hunter. A good hunter is one who's skillful enough to go out and find meat and then come back and deliver it to, his mate and his kids and the rest of the tribe. And if he fails, it's not just a failure of skill. It's also treated as kind of a moral failing.
Mm.
Like bad hunters are kind of like evil and lazy.
Mm.
Likewise, if you're in a tribe and you're going out and doing like intertribal warfare, and you really need to rely on the guys next to you not to flake out and not to complain, oh, I've got a bellyache, I can't go on the raid to protect our tribe. Oh man, the moral judgment is effing intense. And people who betray, their brothers in arms will never be allowed to forget it, like as long as they live. Likewise, there's a lot of sexual morality. There's a lot of parental morality about who's doing a good job taking care of their kids and protecting them instead of like letting them wander out into the lake where there are crocodiles. That's all moral judgment. But then once you get a situation where, let's say, imagine you're a medieval peasant. You're living on your little family land. Maybe you're all serfs. You hardly interact with other families very much. And maybe, you're taken by your parents to a market town for the first time. And suddenly, oh my God, there's hundreds of strangers from all different farms, miles away from you. You don't know them. You don't know their names. But you're trying to sell them stuff, and they're trying to sell you stuff. Suddenly, you're in a situation that would have been, I think, quite rare in prehistory, where there's a whole new set of moral issues that come online when you're kind of in a free market interacting with strangers, and you're trying to cultivate your reputation so that next week when you come back to the market town, people will go, oh, you know, those folks make, you know, the best arrowheads or plows or sell the best produce or whatever. And so suddenly you kind of have to put your game face on as a little medieval entrepreneur. And you have to interact with people you may never see again, but who will gossip about the quality of your goods and services. And various economic historians like Deirdre McCloskey have written about how this kind of favors the bourgeois virtues, that you need to develop new kind of codes of morality for dealing with markets where you're going to be judged by what you deliver to your customers or your investors or your suppliers or whatever. And it's not really to do with your personal traits as a, you know, lover or parent or sibling. It's to do with a slightly more kind of abstract and public set of virtues as a market participant. And I think in a way, the complexity of that morality may have kind of peaked not in the present day, but actually a century or two ago. In the present day, in a way, it's easier. Like, I'm renting an Airbnb here for a couple months. I didn't need to rely on reputation through word of mouth. All I have to do is be able to see 5 stars is better than 3 stars, according to, you know, the ratings by all the other Airbnb guests over the years. So if you can kind of systematize the moral judgments about quality in a market in terms of like Uber ratings, Google ratings, Airbnb ratings, you know, reviews by tech journalists or whatever, that actually reduces the cognitive load and makes things way simpler than it might have been a couple decades ago. But it also holds everybody up in a way to kind of a higher ethical standard, because suddenly you're in a kind of ethical panopticon where everybody's judging everybody else,
right,
and giving continual feedback.
Yes, very interesting point. It's almost as if I've been talking to John Vervaeke. I think I mentioned that previously, and he has this concept of psychotechnology, where it's not a physical tool, but it's like literacy or numeracy. It's a cognitive instrument that we use. And it's almost like morality is somehow related to that in a way, or virtue perhaps, because these aren't just arbitrary, super subjective norms that we come up with. They're you know, honesty is important across all people and all situations, as I would say these other virtues are. So in a way, as we become wealthier through deepening the division of labor, we're actually increasing the emphasis on virtue, behavior governed by virtue, I guess you may say. So you're kind of pushing virtue to the surface of human behavior. And maybe another way of saying that is lowering your time preference, because I guess the lower your time preference, the more long-term thinking you are, therefore the more virtuous you would tend to be. So what I'd like to do is read an excerpt from your book, which I think opens up where we're headed today. It says, the hypothesis here is that sexual selection shaped at least some of our distinctively human moral virtues as reliable fitness indicators. Precursors of many human moral virtues, such as empathy, fairness, and peacemaking, have been found in other great apes. My claim is not that sexual selection created our moral virtues from scratch in our species alone. Rather, sexual selection amplified our standard social primate virtues into uniquely elaborated human forms. And you go on to say, besides sexual selection, many other forms of social selection probably shaped human morality, including kin selection, reciprocal altruism, discriminative parental solicitude, commitment mechanisms, risk sharing mechanisms, social norms and punishment mechanisms, group selection, equilibrium selection among alternative evolutionary strategies. You said more on that later. So it's fascinating to me. Again, we're coming back to that quote from Aristotle that this is all, the change in these attributes is all exchange driven, right? Whether we're talking about cooperative sexual exchange, market exchange, or competitive exchange. Maybe you could just speak to that a bit. I know that's a lot, it's a big opening, but maybe you could just speak to what direction that is sending this, the rest of the exploration of this chapter.
So I kind of mentioned all those other types of social interactions and types of social selection pressures, which is ways that evolution shapes us through how we deal with other, people. I mentioned all that, to try to say, look, Miller's not saying that only mating shaped human morality.
Mm-hmm.
I think mating was important. I think looking good to potential mates and keeping their love and respect over the long term has been pretty central to the evolution of human morality. But it's not the end of the story. There's a lot of really technical terms in there, like discriminative parental solicitude. What the hell is that? That basically means, like it or not, parents, when they're raising kids, are all the time making judgments about, is this a good kid or a bad kid? How much, energy and attention and investment do I put in this kid versus that kid? Some kids are kind of duds and you don't expect very much of them. Other kids are like, have amazing potential and you want to nurture them and really help them. And then other kids might be really, really needy and they need a lot of care or else they won't thrive at all. So parents are making these kind of intuitive calculations all the time. Mm. And among the things that they're evaluating is, the kind of moral virtues of their kids. Mm. If you're a parent and you see your kid, being really nice and caring to another kid, even when you're not watching, or they don't think you're watching, you get this kind of warm glow of parental pride, like, that's a good kid, good for you, awesome, I taught them well. Or they're just naturally good or something. And when you see your kid being, mean to a friend, or even worse, if they're older, like mean to their boyfriend or girlfriend, it's massively embarrassing, and you feel a kind of secondhand, moral shame about that. So there's a story to be told about each of those kinds of relationships. Same with friends. If you have good long-term friendships, like I've had the good fortune to have, multi-decade friendships, you feel morally accountable to your best friends. Mm-hmm. And if you kind of let them down in some way, or even you do something unrelated to them that they'll judge to be like an ethical blunder, that's also really embarrassing. We feel the weight of accountability to those friends. Mm. So I'm just trying again to put morality back into the real social relationships that we have every day with the people who are important to us. And to kind of remind people, morality is not this, it's not this kind of luxury thing where like, well, once I get to be 50 and I've like made my fortune, then I can worry about which money I give to what charity. Mm-hmm. It's got to be there all the way through your life. It's not like a sort of leisure activity you can just sort of add on later.
Interesting. And then so the conscious development of virtue, that is a useful aim in life, because that, I guess the feedback goes the opposite direction. The more you develop these characteristics, the more you improve your sociality and satisfaction in your friends and romantic partners and such. The more successful you are in life, right? The more connection you have, the more happiness, the more wealth you can generate, I guess, even with professional relationships. That feeling of pride you just mentioned, where if a parent sees a child interacting well, exhibiting good moral virtue in a situation, that you feel, oh, that's a good kid, versus the reverse of them perhaps not doing that so much. Is that connected to that same desire for your genes to succeed in that way? Like, you want your child to succeed across the broadest set of games possible in life.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because when you're nurturing a kid, there's kind of a social taboo against talking about this in a straight up honest way. But partly what you're nurturing is, you're creating a kind of vessel for your genes that hopefully ends up in grandkids and great grandkids.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been under selection to be the kinds of parents who worry about that, who plan for that, where that kind of is the end game, is creating not just offspring that are good at surviving, good at making a living, but creating offspring who will be attractive to potential mates and find mates and form good relationships and have kids in turn. And worrying about the moral virtues of your kids, in a sense, what you're doing is you're kind of front running the moral judgments that their future potential mates will make about them.
Interesting.
Right? You're kind of like crafting somebody who's like ready to make their ethical debut in the mating market, who's sort of better equipped, not just in terms of their appearance and their accomplishments and their education, but also better equipped kind of morally than maybe their sexual rivals are. And this is the story not just of bourgeois morality in the market. It's also the story of bourgeois family morality, where back in Victorian England, parents paid a huge amount of attention to cultivating the moral virtues in their offspring so that they would be presentable in polite society. And that sounds very quaint now, but it's not that different from like modern hipster parents making damn sure that their kids at least understand the ethics of veganism before they move to Brooklyn.
Yeah, right.
Because they know they're going to be interacting with a bunch of vegans in Brooklyn. And if they don't know why some people are ethical vegans, they will be morally handicapped in that mating market.